Good afternoon. We are going to start, please. So, this is the conclusion afternoon of the IFoU conference. And the program of this part of the conference is the following. At first, I will ask Ken Fitzsimmons, teacher of the School of Architecture and Landscape of Bordeaux, who give us a word from the director of Arc and Rev, Patricio Galanti. After that, we have the two keynotes conclusion of the conference. Tatjana SCHNEIDER, sorry, and Paola Vigano, which will speak after that, and we will have Osin Aliwanshao, a teacher of ENSAP, as moderator. And after that, we will have the very first activity of the conference. It is the IFoU parallel report session. And also after that, the announcement of the next conference. And at the end, just the award for closing the ceremony and the cocktail we have in the same place we were just before. So Ken, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an unexpected honor to represent Fabrizio Galanti, director of the Arc en Rev Architecture Center, today, who can't be with us, but who wrote a welcome message for you all. So I will read it. It's sent in French, so I'll be translating as I read. Good afternoon, toutes et tous, everyone. I wanted to address this word of welcome, although I'm not present. And it's a message that I've transmitted to Carlos Gottlieb, in parentheses, who transmitted it to me, close parentheses. And it's to Carlos that we owe your presence today at Arc en Rev, because he organized it. Being able to host you and welcome you here at Arc en Rev, and to present to you our reflections, our thoughts, which here take the form of exhibitions around the themes of the city, is a very important occasion for Arc en Rev. We believe in one of... Oh, so it's better if I'm closer up, there's less feedback. Sorry, so Fabrizio continues to speak here. We believe in one of the postulates of the Italian architect Giancarlo De Carlo, for whom there's no real conceptual difference between architecture and urbanism, except perhaps in the scale or dimension of the objects of our projects. You've been able to appreciate quickly the lifestyles in peri-urban situations and how they are negotiated at the level of each single family house in the MBL exhibition, or vice versa in the readings of the Grau firm. You've been able to see how the incredibly large scale of the grid in a city like Chicago can actually touch the private life of its citizens. In common, the issue was political relations, which permit to instigate and support the direct appropriation of environments by their inhabitants. We hope that these thoughts and reflections have resonated with the interests and themes that have been the subject of the conference here in Bordeaux. Looking at the list of guests and speakers in the conference, we've noticed that many amongst you are recurring references and constant references that we look to with much attention. For example, when we think about our lines of communication and our lines of curatorship, which are in relation to our mission, the institutional mission of Arc en Rev. It is therefore with great honor that we welcome you at Arc en Rev today, hoping that your short passage here will be maybe just one stage in the context of future dialogue. In the end, we're all driven by the same preoccupations and the same desire to operate, to act for the common good. Thank you very much. Fabrizio Galanti, Director, Arc en Rêve Architecture Center.
So sorry, because I haven't printed the paper, so I have to stick with my computer screen. So it's my honor to introduce our two keynote speakers for the closing session of this conference. I'm talking about Tatjana SCHNEIDER and Paola VIGANO. What I propose to do is just to give, before you intervene, a very short bio to talk about you. I'll be obliged to read. I'll try and make it more naturally as possible. And then each of you will have the given time for your presentation. So I'll start with you, dear Tatjana. So you're a professor for architectural theory and you're head of the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture and the City. And you're also head of the Architecture and Engineering Collection at the Technische Universität Braunschweig. We didn't kill it. In the face of the climate change emergency, you consider that wider epochal transformations and increasing socio-spatial inequalities. In this context, your work is concerned with case studies that promote principles of common good and justice. Your work focuses on how we can resist violent, exploitative, speculative, and exclusionary productions of architecture, city, and space. It is important to Tatjana to address the impact of these changes on the profession, practice, and education of social planners, architects, and city makers to shape other forms of organizing, working, and producing. She is particularly concerned with the social, economic, and political parameters within and through which architectures and city emerge, as well as the tools and methods that enable people to intervene transformatively in the production of space. She is co-author and co-editor of books such as Flexible Housing in 2007, Agency in 2009, A Right to Build in 2011, Spatial Agency in both 2011 and 16, Living the City, of Cities, People and Stories in 2020, and Making Futures in Spring 2022, which is just now. She's currently working on a series of research projects that focus on spatial practice in the face of the climate emergency, most notably architecture after architecture. In 2001, she ran for mayor of the Braunschweig city where she lives. Voilà. Thank you and welcome to that.
Now I need to get my notes up, and this is working, right? Okay. So thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today, and at the same time being able also to speak to you about the things that are close to my heart. And this is broadly evolving around, as the title says here, spatial practice, and I will very broadly refer to the climate emergency. No? And of course, there's other words that exist for this situation we're in, but I use climate emergency just for today. We had lots of input over the past couple of days. Shall I use the mic? Is that better? Okay, good. We had lots of input over the last couple of days on I don't know how to be here. Just let me sort myself out. Okay. About ways to address this, ways to address the situation we're in, and I'm really thankful for that also. But I now also want to zoom out a little bit and look at some broader issues which have not overtly been mentioned, and I think there's multiple elephants in the room, in the rooms and spaces still we have been in over the past days. And within this in mind, I want to talk about the production of space, and the total and utter mess we are in, and I would include education, research and practice in that mess, whilst I also want to sketch out very gently a possible role also for education in the broadest sense, so not just university education, that is concerned with educating people that are future makers instead of future eaters. I also want to talk about criticality and the world of words. After all, we're all immersed also in that world of words. For words, as Isabel Stengers also notes, have power. No? Words have immense power. So I want to say a few things about me before I start. I studied architecture, but never really became an architect in the traditional sense, since I couldn't bear quite quickly the double standards of this practice, the unreconstructed patriarchal systems, the continuation of colonial extractivist practices without so much of a second thought. So I left it, but I stayed also in a way true to that field. I did a PhD in architecture. I still teach at a school of architecture, but I'm also at the same time shoving and pushing for an expanded understanding of that field, one in which buildings and cities are not, as in the photos here, a commodity traded for profits on international markets, but one that is emancipatory and transformative. And for this to happen, for the production of space to take place in such a manner, I think it requires different questions and different knowledges and not just different gadgets. And I'll expand on those points over the next 30 minutes or so. Now I have to go to the next slide. I don't know how to do this here. Ah, okay. That was one too many. Okay, good. So with this in mind, I want to respond to, on the one hand, the conference itself, which talks about how we face the multiple challenges of an ecological transition in a changing world. And on the other hand, the stuff that we find around us, that I find around me. And you've seen some of this on the slide before. So much, too much, I call it business as usual, in the face of massive ecological challenges and changes. So I want to start with that second point, these massive ecological changes. Someone said yesterday that there is maybe no point in being alarmist right now. In fact, he said, it might be downright dangerous also, for it might not be helpful, because people might be put off by that alarmist manner, and that people might be indeed to stop listening, actually, if we continue to have and talk about all these things in an alarmist manner. The fact is, however, that the present condition is indeed dramatic at best, and we see this in graphs that display this period that is generally referred to as the Great Acceleration, which charts socioeconomic and Earth system trends. And this is the table on the left-hand side, and you're probably all familiar with that. Since the 1950s, we have seen an exponential growth increase in environmental degradation with a simultaneous increase in economic growth. And, but I want to focus attention on the Earth system trends, the ones that you see on the right-hand side, the ones in green, and you can't read this, so I read some of the headlines here, and the graphs always show the period from 1950 to 2000, and I think it's 2015 on the right-hand side. It charts surface temperature of the planet. It charts ocean acidification. It's about the fishing industry. It charts rainforest loss. It charts domesticated or harnessed land. There's charts about coastal nitrogen, atmospheric methane levels, and so on and so forth. And all this, as you can see, is expanding, and this is maybe also in line with the world population since the 1950s, but some of it has been increasing exponentially over the last 10 to 15 years. And of course, the scientific community is unanimous about this. There's no doubt that all of these changes, especially those in the Earth systems category, are produced by human activities. So forgive also my anguish. Things are dire. And they have been for a while, and this is acknowledged in the setup, of course, of Earth Day, which you see on the right-hand side. That was 1970, and the infamous report Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome, 1972. But this anguish can really be traced back to much earlier, back to the 19th century, actually, which is what the book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, outlines in quite some detail. So scholars and researchers back then, I think it was 1885 or so, outlining in quite some detail the conditions they were in and predicting also what would happen. So business as usual, even if it comes with a green label, doesn't get us out of this mess, I would argue. And as the feminist geographer Catherine Gibson writes, planetary and social systems are under such immense stress that we need to devise new ways of architecting the care of socioeconomic relationships and the materials and infrastructures that contain and create them. So, just want to say here, we have known for a while that things will get bad, and this is, in a way, the context of our work. You will know, oh gosh, here, continue here. You will know maybe pictures like these or photographs of similar situations, and I use them here to illustrate the inherent violence that is built into our cities and spaces all over the globe, which was brought about by, of course, huge networks and systems of expansion that entirely neglected local consequences. And I'm mentioning this here, this point about localness, quite explicitly, because I also heard so many times in the past couple of days, but I've been hearing that, of course, over the last few years, that solutions to the crisis have to be local, can only be local, which, forgive me for saying this so bluntly, I find at least a bit of a double-edged sword. Well, why do I say this? Many environmental issues, many issues of inequality are deeply rooted, of course, in historic structures of colonialism and the exploitation of Gaia by a small group of hegemonic forces, a small group of countries as well. And these structures, and this is what this image of Johannesburg stands for, were driven by ambitions which far exceeded local dimensions. Think, for example, about the expansive networks of British and other trading companies going far back into the 16th century, and they exploited the local whilst working on expanding their own global networks to increase the profits from that exploitation. Okay, so what you see here is another reminder that there really is no local. Small change, it is often argued, leads to social change, and consequently, lots of instances of small change put together will eventually change the world, change the way we produce, consume, exchange, or even and also distribute stuff. And in fact, this powerful force of combined small changes, it is argued, will then lead up to the induction of much bigger, much more systemic change. And the political economist, Greg Scharzer, which I'm quoting here on the slide, is probably one of the most fervent opponents of this way of thinking. And he writes, and you see it here on the slide as well, the localist form of citizenship may empower us, but it cannot confront capitalism. Against the global network of power must emerge globalized forms of struggle. And Scharzer doesn't have any sympathies for localism or localists. In his book, No Local, Why Small-Scale Alternatives Won't Change the World, Scharzer argues quite compellingly that localists would not choose to be localists if they had, I quote, a greater understanding of how capitalism works. And it is capitalism, or you could also talk about maybe more imperialism, which you see at work in these pictures. Okay. So I believe, and don't get me wrong here, firmly in the local. However, I do think too that the basis for any understanding of the production of space begins quite a while before we begin to bring in fancy gadgets. Research means getting your hands dirty, and I think everyone who's doing research knows what I mean. Or, as Donna Haraway says, no, we need to stay with the trouble. We need to become complicit. We need to take sides. We should never take no for an answer and dig deeper and deeper and deeper as you go. So asking difficult questions and often very uncomfortable questions, not just for oneself, but also for the other side. You could even be more clear on this. Research, I think we have to be, we have to say quite clearly, and neither is education. Neither research nor education is partial, is unpartial, is impartial. We're not partial in what we do. We take sides the moment we apply for a job. We take sides the moment we choose to apply for a research grant. We choose sides and are partial the moment we elect to engage with one actor over another. And also the maps we do are hardly neutral instruments. And all of this needs to be considered carefully. The way mapping is done needs to be considered carefully. And here, and there's always obviously the necessary engagement with the history of cartography and its entanglement with powers. It is crucial at the same time to understand, to truly understand that space doesn't just happen. It never is not just what we see on the surface or what we find when we scrape the surface a little bit and a little bit of dust comes up. There are always power structures at play, there's always ambitions, there's always motivations, there's always interest of capital and so much more. So when we choose not to see this, not to engage with this, and try to remain sort of detached, solutions remain futile. And I'm quoting Henri Lefebvre here, who is himself referring to Karl Marx, and he says, and this is another quote you see here on the slide, when no heed is paid to the relations that inhere in social facts, knowledge misses its target. Our understanding is reduced to a confirmation of the undefined and indefinable multiplicity of things and gets lost in classifications, descriptions, and segmentations. Now we can ask, what does that mean for us also in this context and the production and reproduction of space in the wider sense? Surely any work done needs to take into account much more than the social and cultural dimensions. It needs to address power, which is visible in the ways how labor is organized and how resources are being extracted from Gaia. It is visible in who is in charge of extraction processes, or it is visible, obviously, in those who benefit or profit from those processes. How do we get to something different as well? And I think also some people have mentioned ways of doing over the past few days. We talked quite a lot of interdisciplinary working. There was talk about unlearning. There was talking about working with instead of working for, working with communities, working with neighborhoods, working with people, and so on and so forth. But this in itself is not enough, I would say, since it is only a method without positioning. So key to the big issues at hand is the positioning, I would say, before choosing a method. It is about questioning, on critically examining and confronting also the systems and processes that we have become so accustomed to. Okay, so take the promise, for example, of the smart city that is monitored, it's fully electrified and therefore clean and safe and not noisy and terribly beautiful. And these are obviously the big selling points of these constructs. Now, the important bit, and this is why I think that the focus on the local is short-sighted at best, falls short of global responsibilities. And I think you'll know what I'm getting at. It is a discussion about the resources and mechanisms that allow for the technology that brings about this smart city to come into existence. And some of these processes, which I did not mention explicitly, but you saw glimpses of this before, are simply not of the sort that should be recommended as a future that has a future. Take lithium and the huge environmental problems that its extraction causes. Take cobalt, take coal, which is obviously in the game again suddenly as a means to produce energy because of the Ukraine war. Okay, I'm going on. This is another slide illustrating the inextricable and inescapable entanglements that we find ourselves in, the bushfires in Australia, the ash 2,000 kilometers through the air, sort of landing on the New Zealand glaciers. The glaciers are covered with this red ash. The sunlight is not reflecting properly back again, so it all contributes to everything melting quicker than before. So entanglements, and then obviously the chart below showing sea level rises in maybe some distant but maybe not so distant future. And this is another one illustrating the issue of entanglement from the perspective of the building and construction industry. We could talk about sand, lots of other materials that, of course, have a global perspective. So the situation is complex, and forgive me for being so gloomy also on a Friday afternoon, but I couldn't help myself. But on many levels, it's also very clear. Take the short quote from the article published in The Lancet by Jason Hickel. So this is the one on the left-hand side, where it says the global north is responsible for 92% of global emissions, but it's the global south that suffers more than 90% of the cost of climate breakdowns. When we look at who's responsible for what I've been referring to as mess, it is the global north, and here it refers to Canada, to Europe, to Israel, to Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. 90% of global emissions are caused by the global north. Who suffers? It's also very clear it's the global south. And in fact, it's the global south which is then band-aided by numerous global north forces through acupunctural interventions that refuse to engage and hide behind a seemingly neutral agenda driven solely by technological advances, rational knowledge, and non-biased engineering degrees who argue for localized solutions to problems and issues that sit on the global north's back. Andy Merrifield has a word for those people, and he calls them parasites who, as he writes, chomp away the Commonwealth the world over. And I just want to read that quote. He says, parasites chomp at the Commonwealth the world over, eating away inside the social body, stripping people's assets, foreclosing homes, dispossessing value rather than contributing anything towards its creation. In parasitic cities, social wealth is consumed through conspicuously wasteful enterprises, administered by parasitic elites, our very own aristocracy. He's talking about England there, the 1% who squander generative capacity by thriving exclusively from unproductive activities. They roll dice on the stock market, profit from unequal exchanges, guzzle at the public trough. They filch rents and treat land as pure financial and speculative asset as a form of fictitious capital. And to illustrate what he's talking about, you see here the painting by Natascha Ungeheuer. It's called The Conference, and you see sort of people sitting with their backs to the city around this chessboard, and they're talking amongst themselves, and they're pushing parts of the city and elements of the city, people, factory, churches, buildings. They're pushing these things across the board as they see fit, making deals as they go along. Okay, so I continue the story of entanglements here because this is a world within which architecture and the production of space is generally situated. Generally speaking, buildings and infrastructures are expressions of other processes, and they are expressions of processes and decisions that are often completely non-transparent. And to talk about entanglements here then also means to talk about political cronyship. We need to talk about nepotism. We need to talk about global shadow financial systems, transnational real estate development companies, funds and other constructs. And this then, and I think this is really important, is also a story about buildings as capital investment. The Germans say Betongold, golden concrete. There's a lot of money to be made with the building of buildings. And the scope of these machinations obviously became clear again in October 2021 when the Pandora Papers were published, about 12 million confidential documents that resulted again in a global debate about the entanglement of the financial industry and public policy. It made obvious how large and active the role of architectures as well as cities is in this mix. What needs to be deducted from this? Well, I guess the position that buildings and infrastructures or anything we might do within them as innocent objects is absolutely untenable, and buildings are, very broadly speaking, veritable money-sucking and money-printing machines, and not just buildings, infrastructures too, and are commonly also conceived as such. So in order to then be traded as commodities, often on the global financial market by property developers and so on and so forth. So really, yeah, quite a lot of gloom, I apologize. Just a few things before I attempt a turn as well. What you see here again is architecture obviously as capital, or capital disguised as architecture. And it is, and this is what the article on the platform Failed Architecture on the top left is about, the face of violent processes and systems of extraction. No? We talk about labor, we could talk about materials, we could talk about finance, and you name it. No? And despite all hope that things might finally turn because we work in local manners with local communities and in local ways, there are also those many stories in the room that talk about global building activity hitting record highs. This is the world's consumption of materials hits record tons of 100 billion a year. That was 2021. There's stories about inequality hitting record highs. There's talk about economic growth still equaling, for many governments, panacea to all our problems. There's ongoing enclosures of the commons. There's deepening ecological crises. There's reliance on oil, gas, and coal. And we still work with timelines that hardly even exceed parliamentary terms. So regardless of where you go on the planet, we work in parliamentary terms of 4 to 5 years. Some exceptions, but not many. Ethics remaining a firm blind spot. And learning environments, also another gloomy story, despite so many really interesting attempts, largely unreconstructed. And we continue to believe also this fairy tale of green growth and the possibility of a last-minute bailout. Yet a lot is at stake, which George Monbiot, British writer and activist, brings to a point. He wrote an article just after the after COP26 last autumn, and this is what he says. Now it's a straight fight for survival. The Glasgow Climate Pact, for all its restraint and diplomatic language, looks like a suicide pact. After so many squandered years of denial, distraction and delay, it's too late for incremental change. A fair chance of preventing more than 1.5 centigrades of heating means cutting greenhouse gas emissions by about 7% every year, faster than they fell in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. Okay, so no small undertaking for anyone involved in thinking, doing, or transforming space, but at the same time, many of us, many of you might also say that this is, that there are lots of solutions, obviously, that there are seeds of hope, in a way, sprouting everywhere. So in a way, what I'm talking about might seem a little bit old hat, because there's lots of people working on this, and there's lots of people doing really interesting stuff, and lots of people doing exactly what needs to be done. And you might also say that groups and practices and collectives which are doing things in other ways are growing in number too, and have been maybe over the past few years. After all, in architecture we have Lacaton Vassal winning the Pritzker Prize, we have Francis Carré winning the Pritzker Prize, and it might also be sort of a sign for turning tides. But as I began to outline before, this is not necessarily my point. The point I want to get to is that this bit-by-bit approach, someone doing something here, someone doing something there, someone other doing something there, is the island or band-aid scale isn't or cannot be the finish line, right? Or in the words of Arturo Escobar, author of the book Designs for the Pluriverse, this is what you find here. He says, today, faced with the realities of a world transformed by a changing climate, humans are confronted with the irrefutable need to confront the design disaster that development is, and hence to engage in another type of elimination design, this time of the structures of unsustainability that maintain the dominant ontology of devastation. So it's quite damning, actually, but also quite a call to arms, really, and to do something which is much bigger than the sum of these individual parts. So I'm now at a point where I could begin, as I said earlier, to show examples that illustrate maybe where and how glimpses of this other possible world reveal themselves. I actually decided to leave you hanging here a little bit, at least because I do not want to illustrate what follows also with photographs. Let me try to quickly maybe bring this together, however, and then later I can also talk about examples over a drink or so. What I have argued for is that new gadgets won't help to heal these really deep wounds that we're facing of centuries of unequal development. An unequal development that has brought us an understanding of the world where so-called rational knowledge seems to trump everything else. To be clear, I'm talking here about Western knowledge systems that have suppressed all other forms of knowledges to the point of almost extinction. And this is what my work or my research and teaching is currently concerned with, understanding these contexts within which I or we work, and the principles that foster other relationships that are non-extractivist and non-violent. And the fuzzy slide here begins to tell this story. It's an emerging database that brings together practices, knowledges, policies, concepts, and many other things that cannot necessarily be illustrated with pictures that counter current hegemonial thinking. So in a nutshell, we talk about different governance systems, we talk about credit unions, we talk about cooperatives, we talk about principles of repair, so reconfiguring not only of stuff but also of social and wider economic relations, the dissolution of enclosures, the socialization of housing and other common goods, the redefining of coexistence and interdependence, the decommodification of stuff, and sort of lots of different things. And of course, there's examples. I could show you housing estates where this is being done. I could talk about different economic models and so on and so forth. There are plenty of examples that attempt to do things at larger scales, but also, I think more importantly, in sort of networked scales across different dimensions of operations. So not just on a local level, but also across countries and across continents. I bring this to an end with a story, a short story, which is about a proposal for the development of the Hafen City, the harbor city in Hamburg. The proposal was made by the English architect Cedric Price, who died in 2003, and for me is maybe still one of the most radical thinkers and architects of our time. And what was important to Price is, and for which he was almost notorious, was his consistent questioning of the initial situation, of the tasks, and even of his clients. So he never really, he got briefs, but he never really, he read them, but he never actually did what he was initially, what he was asked to do. He always wanted to know what was behind the words, what was behind an assignment, what the true motivations and so on and so forth were. So he asked how much building, how much producing is actually necessary, whether building and producing is always really the best solution. This is what he probably is best known for. What you see here now dates from 1989, so it's quite it's quite old already. And at the time, price was guest at the Hamburg Building Forum, the fourth Hamburg Building Forum. And the topic for this forum was the future design of the then vacant docklands in the port of Hamburg. So whoever knows Hamburg, maybe from recent years, it's the blue bit is the bit that's been developed into the Elbphilharmonie. Herzog and de Meuron is on the corner there. So this big opera building sits at the tip of this development, and it's entirely plastered with sort of housing and other facilities, with continuation of the city. And at the time, the city of Hamburg asked renowned architects to respond to their brief. And among the architects was the American Michael Graves, and Kees Christianse was amongst them, who eventually also won the master plan. And whilst most of the architects present are now, or were then practicing the arrangement of building blocks on that site, Cedric Price was doing something completely different. Although the docklands are presented by the city and the organizers, or were presented by the city and the organizers of the building forum as a much needed area for housing, for thousands of flats, cultural, sports and leisure facilities, and I'm quoting here, for a lively extension of the city center on and in the harbor, thus also setting the general direction of that march, Price proposes to turn the docklands into ducklands. And instead of buildings, roads and other infrastructure, Price's proposal is to form a nature reserve for migratory birds, which is then presented from the point of view of migratory birds. So ducklands stands for consciously keeping the former harbor area free of buildings and other massive infrastructures and prioritizing ecosystems. And obviously, clearly, the implementation of something like that would have had very decisive spatial and socio-spatial consequences. And under certain circumstances, it might have also increased the development pressure on other parts of the city. But this is not what I find important in examples like this. What is written here and what is with its absolute boldness is a plea, I think, for a different city, a different way of thinking about the city, and that is precisely something that, in my opinion, is sorely lacking in contemporary discourse. Whether this is an answer to the climate emergency, I doubt it, but I believe that projects such as this are needed, such ideas, in order to find out also, perhaps formulated somewhat provocatively, what architecture and the city must be able to do, and for whom. And therefore I close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tatjana. Do we take questions now, or? Yeah? It depends. If anyone wants to intervene or make any observation or questions at this stage, you're more than welcome. Or otherwise, we go on to the second presentation and then have a global discussion. We do it that way? Okay. So we welcome you, Paola Vigano. I will also shortly make a presentation. So the next presentation is by Paola Vigano, who is an architect and an urbanist. She is full professor in urban theory and urban design at the EPFL, where she directs the Habitat Research Center and the Lab U. And at the EUAV Venice, she received the French Grand Prix de l'Urbanisme in 2013, the title of Doctor Honoris Causa by UC Louvain in 2016, in the frame of Utopia for Our Time. The Flemish Culture Award for Architecture in 2017 and the Golden Medal to the career of Milano Triennale in 2018. Together with Bernardo Secchi, she founded Studio that worked between 1990 and 2014, working on numerous projects and visions in Europe. Since 2015, Studio Paola Vigano works on the ecological and social transitions of cities, landscapes and territories, designing urban and territorial projects and realizing public spaces in Europe. In 2019, her work has been exhibited at the Shenzhen Biennale and in 2021 at the Venice Biennale. And amongst her recent publications, in 2022, Life as a Common, Space for a New Biopolitical Project. I'll go through very quickly. In 2016, Territories of Urbanism, the project as knowledge producer. And in 2016, with Bernardo Secchi and Fabian Lorenzo, Water and Asphalt, the project of Isotropy, Zurich. The floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, thanks for being here. It's the last moment of 4 very intense days, so I really appreciate that you are still here. And I would like also to greet, I don't know if Vivienne is online, and Jürgen, if you are online, hello, how are you? I hope you are well. And thank you also for the invitation to this IFoU conference, which I follow since many years. I think it would be very nice to react immediately to Tatjana's presentation. I hope to bring a kind of complementary gaze. And you see this title, but first of all, this picture is the theater plane in Antwerp that we realized with Bernardo a few years ago, and it's a space that brought a piece of the center that was completely degraded into a kind of different life or different practices, and is also a true stage where people can make performances. This is the Lars von Trier Dogville performance made on the square, and the garden is also collecting, of course, all the rainwater coming from the roof and through the pillars, and then also all the impermeable surface where big markets are organized every week. So the transition, a new biopolitical project, is a working hypothesis. I'm not interested to know if it is true or not true. I'm just interested to know if it is efficient or interesting to use, to reflect on the change that we are going through, and to the meaning for us as architects and urbanists to work into this transformation, and in a way being very, very modest inside this transformation. However, this is where we are. And what is the role of design in such a condition? So I will go through 3 sets of themes that are open towards several design questions. The first one is we are elaborating a culture of the transition. At least we are in the need to elaborate such culture. It's not something automatic. I agree with what Tatjana was saying about the fact that incremental efforts are really very minimal. Recently, hearing some scientists working on the last IPCC report, I understood that in fact nothing is changing. So the level of emissions is stable. So although we are trying to bring, say, our piece of effort, things are not really going nowhere. So that's a really problematic point. I think that we have to elaborate this culture of the transition, which is also to go through the traditional culture of the building and rebuilding and transforming territories and cities and architecture. So we have to to make a new, to construct a new Baukultur that is coherent to this culture of the transition, because our Baukultur is not coherent. So there, for me, there is a gap in the understanding, in the research, and let's say we have to work, I think, in this direction. I will use some experience, design experiences to go through the different themes. So the first one is a big new neighborhood on a former industrial and military area in Rennes, so the La Courouse urban project, where we took the time. So we started in 2003, so very long time. We had the time to go to understand in deep this situation and to make a project that wants to try to say that between urbanization and ecology, there is a way to construct an alliance. This is going through a very deep understanding of the soils, for example, of this place. I'm not speaking of the polluted soils. That's, let's say, more technical. There are things that we can say, but also we have to look for what we can do with those soils. I'm thinking of all the rest, or what you can recover from those polluted soils, and try to consider that there are, even in such an industrial and military area, there are areas that are maintained by the army as gardens, that are the green, where we can, let's say, work on top of what was already there, and some incredible hotspot of biodiversity that are some of the red areas. And then there is the yellow, the white, etc. A lot of areas where there is nothing, there was nothing in terms of life. There were barren soils. And still there is something you can do with that. So the master plan, that is a document that is periodically transformed, but where some lines remains of the main, let's say, infrastructure of the city, started in 2003 with the idea of landscape as infrastructure. And today is more and more evolving towards the idea that we are reconstructing, regenerating soils together with regenerating the city. So you regenerate soils while you regenerate the city, and vice versa. They are not, let's say, completely antithetic. And all that is mainly based on the reuse of this barren soil, and bringing really very small quantities of organic soil, just to give a little bit of, to help a little bit to reestablish new life, and with a water management that is completely in the public space, on the surface, and maintaining all the existing ponds and trees, and so in a way, through this very the consideration of everything that was already there, reusing also some part of the concrete that has been deconstructed and reused on site, and especially putting the new housing in relation with what was already there. And there is also something important to say, that the 50% of this neighborhood, and I'm talking of about 5,000 new housing, new dwellings, the 50% is intended to be not on the market, so of social housing or say supported kind of housing, and only the 50% is on the free market. So there is also the idea of a kind of a social mix, and this was in the ambition of the city more than in what we could at that moment decide. So as I said, everything is a rereading, so all small traces of the previous industrial and military area are kept, and all the ground is reused as much as possible, and that's where you also work on building spaces for kids, or the regeneration of a very small water course that is receiving all the waters coming from the neighborhood around, which also construct a new nature, or taking care of all the pieces where you have difficult connection between a big infrastructure, this forest passing by, and where you want to have something that can activate the space, and then, for example, the space for skaters. Or reusing some small railway lines, becoming finished path, and really almost designing on site the intervention. Or rediscovering the history of a quay from where the last train that was directed to the concentration camps, the day left from Rennes, the day before the liberation of the city, with the 2,000 people that finally got there, when in fact the city had already been liberated by the Allies. So, I mean, very, very strong histories that you understand step by step why you're working and reading this place. Deciding to leave big areas with a very, very low level of design, like the big prairies, and where some social type of spaces are now being developed. You see there the circus, the school for circus activities, but also in the buildings now there are some neighborhood centers, etc. And where every single tree is considered really like an individual, let's say, and we bring also the density that we needed to maintain in order to construct new relations between these different materials. I think it's going alone, but and changing the design once we understood that the only parcel of still fertile land or organic soil was remaining, so we changed completely the project in order to maintain this part where also schools were existing and also have been realized. And today we are working on the central part of the area, where the old hangars will be transformed in spaces for different economies, let's say solidarity economies and associations. And that we are very happy of this, because at the beginning the idea was to demolish all these buildings, and on the contrary now everybody understands that there is really an interest in maintaining all this part. But you see, just in the upper part we have the construction site of the metro that destroyed everything that was there, and we are maintaining even the level of the ground, because they put a lot of ground on top of the existing situation, and we are trying to work with this new level of the ground without evacuating all the soils that have been put there. To conclude this first point, I think that what we understood by doing this work was this possibility to imagine this urbanism of a living soil, where you bring life in soils that are not alive today, together with the regeneration of the city. At the same time, the city shows itself as a renewable resource. So you can work on the existing materials, even when, in fact, they are polluted, when it's just concrete, when there is no beautiful things to be maintained, but let's say more like more normal industrial materials, and also amazing trees that become the main individuals around which to construct the city. This was made, we started this work together with Bernardo Secchi, who published at the mid of the 80s this important article, The Project of the Ground. And in 2022, so this year, we edited, let's say, with David Pelleman, Martina Barcelloni-Corte, Elizabeth Ronner, the Project of the Soil, that is an issue of Oase magazine, dedicated to this new understanding of the relation between urbanization and the soil. Second set of questions is about cities and territories as laboratories of the transition. Together with the design horizontal metropolis. Design horizontal metropolis means, can we imagine that urbanization is not submitted to this traditional way of thinking in terms of hierarchies, but imagining that the different parts of the territories can get the same rights, the same qualities for life. And here I will use the case of Great Geneva, so that is a vision that we developed together with other teams that were selected by the Fondation Breillat and also the institution in Great Geneva. Great Geneva, I just shortly I have to say, is a transnational metropolis between Swiss and France, and we did this not as an office, but together with the Habitat Research Center that we founded at EPFL a few years ago, and that has urbanization and the urbanization in transition as the core theme or the core research question. So in the Great Geneva, we put we started from two lands, soil again, and labor. And we made explicit this hypothesis of the transition as a new biopolitical project. When I use these terms, of course, you know what is behind them, Foucault, etc. But I use them because in a very simple way, I want to make clear or more explicit that we are really dealing with the construction of new relations between space, life, and politics. So these three terms that are redefining their relations. And space is a crucial issue inside the other two. It is in a way where you can try to construct this new relation or to mediate about opposite needs, let's say, that are coming from the other two sides. This image comes from a very famous movie from Alain Tanner, Jonas, qui aura 25 ans à l'an 2000, so who will be 25 in 2000. Maybe some of you saw this movie. It's true? Yes, some. Those are like my age, I think you have seen. It was a cult movie in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s. And it is a fantastic movie. For those that don't know, I suggest to try to find it and see it. Because it's very important. First, it's saying that the idea of transition is not just this one. We go through different transitions. In the 70s, of course, it was a moment of transition. In Great Geneva, because the movie is in Geneva, in Great Geneva, there was the industrial transition, so the big industry closing. There was a new culture coming, so the return to the land, the return to agriculture, the idea of new types of work, kind of utopia, of education, etc. So many themes that we are discussing today. And my question here is always why we didn't discuss those themes at the moment, why we could not get to the point. But at a certain moment, everything disappeared. Those questions were hidden. Completely hidden, and we started the 80s with a lot of joy and etc., forgetting completely about the problems of scarcity of resources, of the transition. Today this transition has different forms, partially from the past. Many of them are similar. We can start from the question of inhabitability, how our territories will be inhabitable. This is one map realized by Noélie Leconnet that has presented her paper last, I think today or yesterday. So the point is, how can we start to map all these questions about inhabitability? What degree of inhabitability will have our territory when we put together the traditional fragilities of a territory, unstable slopes or I don't know, pollution, flooding, and those that are a little bit more new, like, for example, heating waves. So the red are the very strong, the space where the heating waves will be particularly strong. And it's very important because it's not only Geneva that is on the lower part of the lake, but also alpine valleys, like the Arve valleys, will be very much submitted to this raising temperatures. So it's not just the city. Sometimes we think, oh, the city will be, no, it's also valleys, it's also other types of territory that will be in a severe problems. But also in this transition, we have to consider that still today, the same problems of the 70s are there. So almost all the jobs are on the Swiss side. Almost all the new housing is on the French side. So you have the French side more like a dormitory, and then you have all the wealth that is produced on the Geneva side. That's a fundamental, I would say, injustice, territorial injustice. And this is where I think to the horizontal metropolis as exactly work in the direction of giving the different territories a possibility not to depend on other territories. And those commuters that then are creating, of course, a lot of problems of traffic, et cetera, et cetera. And also to consider that this Great Geneva is made up by hundreds and hundreds of villages, very small, tiny villages. There are some peripheries, there are some cities, of course, and Geneva especially, but half of the population, in fact, is living in this type of scattered villages on the mountains, villages along the rivers, villages close to the forest, into the agriculture. Not just say the diffuse urbanization, but really traditionally, this is a scattered region. And I think we have to work with this type of urbanization, with this structure of the urbanization, while we always tend to concentrate all the means, all the energies, all the investment on some denser areas. While in fact, we have here that 50% of the population is not living in the denser areas. But if you look also at the plans, at the planification, everything is reconducted to this kind of centered type of urbanism, and we are making such an effort not to get out of this kind of rigid paradigm. So first we wanted to represent this territory, recognizing each individuality of each part. So we made a model with the students where every single river, every single mountain, etc., has its own, let's say, individuality. And then, of course, when you put them together, that's the Great Geneva. But we can also look at them one by saying that, in fact, each one has the same dignity. Now, there is not someone that is more important than the others. And this is also a way to speak of the territory as a subject, not just, of course, not as an object, but not even just as a resource, but really as a subject. So a subject that should be present around the table when decisions about this subject are taken. And then we developed some scenarios, always starting from soil and labor scenarios of the transition. I will go quite fast here, but let's say first, the soils are very fundamental to absorb CO2, as you probably know, but there are very different ways to absorb, or capacity to absorb in relation to the type of land use. I want to bring your attention on the fact of also the artificial soil, so the urban soil, is said variable, which means that it has some capacity, but normally we don't consider, but not only we as architects and urbanists, but the pedologists, they don't consider the capacity of this soil to significantly contribute to reduce the CO2 emission. To raise the carbon stock, you have to work on the organic matter of soil, which means to change type of agriculture, to work differently, to labor differently the soil. The second scenario is around adaptations to how, by working on soils, we can try to live better in the future. And here, say, we go from the water management to the heating waves, and there is such a big work to be done in our cities. I mean, if we start to say that, as in Brussels, they are starting to approve this idea that half of each road should not be used for traffic. So it should be used to collect water, to develop biodiversity, and eventually some slow mobility. half of each street. I mean, this is incredible. No? We are simply redesigning our cities completely. And then there is, of course, the food self-sufficiency. And what we discovered by working on Great Geneva is that Great Geneva could be very close to self-sufficiency. Today is not at all, it's very far from that. But in terms of, if we consider a new type of diet, that's very important in general, if we want to be, if we want to continue to be alive, let's say. So there is a strong reduction of the meat consumption, but also a strong attention to the amount of energy that is coming from the outside that is used to produce every single type of cultivation. And there you understand that to produce meat is very expensive in terms of energy, non-local energy. On the contrary, for example, the fruits, so the orchards, are particularly interesting from this perspective. And they say that the fundamental point we wanted to underline is that the soil in the urban context, this is the Canton of Geneva scale, is the same size, the same proportion of the agricultural one. So we are about the 30%, we have 35 agricultural land, 20% is forest, wetlands, etc., and 27% are soil. Now, to address this point, I mean, to consider something that can federate all this type of scenarios and strategies, at the scale of Great Geneva, we thought that we needed to think about a new infrastructure, a weak structure for the metropolis of the future, that can connect all these open spaces that can become federative figures of public space. That doesn't work. Okay, it's worked. A space that we think is important, not really as a space that was designed in similar way almost 1 century ago by the famous Geneva urbanist Maurice Braillard and Baudemer. So they designed spaces of connection, of protection, especially to protect the heritage. They were imagining that the kind of strong modernization process that was ongoing would have completely destroyed. So it was a way to protect at least something of this heritage that is at the same time related to vegetation, big trees, related to certain viewpoints, related to certain villages, related to certain paths, etc. It is a kind of description of the territory that they organized through this diagram. There was also very strong political engagement. They were called surface publique, public surfaces, and this project was completely dismantled immediately once the Socialist Party that was ruling Geneva in the 30s of the 20th century was beaten. And then it was forgotten, but as idea, this plan came about. Everybody that is working in Geneva is, interested to rethink about this diagram. That is not this one, it's similar to this one. This is in which we brought the scale of the Bodmer and Braillard plan to the larger region of Great Geneva, and where we were interested to a common infrastructure, common to city, low-density areas, natural areas, agricultural areas. So this is a kind of weak structure that is for us fundamental to connect this very heterogeneous type of land and region, and also to integrate different types of public spaces and different types also of productive spaces, different types of practices, also practices related to the transition. So let's say if Bodmer and Braillard were interested to protect this type of landscapes, we are interested to announce new types of landscape, where you can work at the same time of the working space, on a space where you can live, on the regeneration of the land, the formulating new types of agriculture. This is quite a long story in the sense that, of course, it seems very gentle, but in fact is quite drastic, and especially in a region where the pressure on the land is particularly heavy. We think it's fundamental to affirm this right of the public surfaces, where public is not just public in the traditional sense, it can be also collective, but the point is things, spaces that are not inside the normal mechanism of land use. Together with this weak structure, of course, we have to consider also the strong or the heavy infrastructure on which the Great Geneva has invested massively in the last years, massively in new tramway lines, especially with the idea that tramway lines will bring the growth and the densification along the lines. What is very interesting that today there is a reaction from the population against the idea of densifying along the tramway lines when they pass through agricultural land. So this mechanism of the idea of, okay, you put a tram and then you densify is showing its limits. And for us, what was very important was especially to clarify that so many small railway lines have been closed. So everything is in orange are pre-existing railway lines that had been dismantled during the last decades, and that we think should be the starting point to reconstruct the possibility for the public transport to structure this land. Now, after the Great Geneva, we were asked by the Canton of Geneva to continue to work with this idea of weak structures. And I think that two also PhD students from the Laboratory of Urbanism, they showed something about that. This is one exercise we did with the students of the new postgraduate master in urbanism, in urban and territorial design that we have just founded together with the ETH in Zurich. And it's about considering this continuity, so the principle of continuity, as a way to reconnect this metropolis, and especially in this sense is how you can, by starting with this connection of open spaces, to reconnect also many other type of practices and functions especially related to marginal or marginalized economies. For some reasons, it's along open spaces that you find a lot of the marginality of a territory. So that's very interesting because we could map them and see how, by working on this continuity of the space, of the public space, and of ecologically also with this idea of ecosystem services working inside it, we can also connect to this kind of network of care that already exists or could be reinforced. I think we need prototypes. And I want to conclude this part by saying that we are not ready for designing this transition. And there I agree completely with Tatjana. We are not yet ready. We are not able politically and economically. We are not capable of doing that. So eco-socio-spatial prototypes are, I think, the only rigorous, intellectually rigorous way of entering this unknown path of the transition. That's why I think we need to advocate for spatial zones or public surfaces, as Braillard was saying 1 century ago, to experiment the transition. And I think that we cannot make the transition inside the actual system. That's the problem. So or we make the revolution immediately, which seems quite strange, or we at least ask for having the space to make it and to show it and to give this space a kind of pioneering role that is not just the small pieces here and there, but something more structural. And so the idea of continuity would be related also to that. And of course, in our field, this space of experimentation is intended to inspire collective debate. And I think this is the only way we have to make things change. Not to, you make something, you collect ideas around that, and you start a process of verification and falsification of worldviews that are inevitably brought together, different worldviews. Now, I don't know how much time I have, because to come back to
5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, then if I have 5 minutes, maybe I will have to, okay, try to be fast here. In the idea of this horizontal metropolis, a big role has had in our work also the reflection on one marginal region in Europe, that is the Wallonian region, one of the region of the coal, where kind of strange condition of decline since decades, because the coal crisis is there since the 60s. So after 50 years, 60 years, the decline is still there. And there are several generations of social declines. Like in other conditions, the idea is that the territory itself can be the way to revise this marginality. The territory has a lot of qualities, and there is something maybe we can imagine. We worked in several situations at different scales, from revising or proposing new spaces in old industrial areas, and bringing also new economies at the scale of this kind of scattered and very diffuse city, where along the river you have very big industrial polluted areas that are today there with a very low kind of attractivity, so waiting for something, to cities where you see all this around are all the terrils, so that the rest of the mining work. And by recognizing also that these cities have been growing together with the industry, they were like a city of foundation. They started as being city at the moment of the Industrial Revolution. They are still kind of young territories, and bringing kind of new imaginary to this territory, where the territory itself is really the starting point for revising the idea of development, working on this very scattered system of civic centers, and then working on the existing strength of economies that are more related to, for example, here, hospital and sport activities that have to articulate the idea of economy that has been, since the beginning, for those cities, just related to industry, now the heavy industry. For example, this is a very big industrial, partially former industrial areas for still with the steel industry in Charleroi. You see the dimension, more than 100 hectares, incredible spaces. And we made this master plan where we tried to bring to the fore the questions related to the themes of the transition in a space where you have so incredible qualities. So I'm sorry that we cannot read the title, but the first point is, of course, to amplify the possibility to recreate ecologies, to reopen water courses, to reconnect with the new parks that are related to the industrial use. The Terril is, of course, a park related to the presence of those new small mountains, to work with concrete parks, because there is an immense amount of pollution, immense, in those areas. To work on the heritage as a system, not just on heritage as, okay, we save a small building. No, you have to understand the logic of this heritage made of infrastructures, made of buildings, and all that is something that you have to understand, to maintain the possibility to understand what has been the past, what has been also the social and political past of a space like that. To go towards the transition of mobilities, because nevertheless there is a very heavy amount of infrastructures for transport. You have a metro, you have trains, you have already a lot of possibilities. To consider the depollution as a process of reconstruction and refoundation of the city. Of course, we had not all the information about the pollution, but we know that it's heavily polluted everywhere. So we will work on maintaining some concrete slabs that are on site and proceeding to dismantle some of them in order to have a kind of process of reconstruction of nature. And imagining that the new activities, there is a big need of becoming attractive again in this place. I mean, the question of jobs is the main point for all politicians. You cannot speak if you don't speak about jobs. So the attractivity of the place, so the new inhabitability of this space is fundamental in this idea of regaining attractivity. And then the new and the existing steel industry that can provide heat. So you can imagine to have a synergy between the different areas. And finally, to profit of the existing seeds, let's say, of transition that are starting to appear also around the border. So the idea that this project should really integrate and connect with what is happening just outside, working on the different type of spaces that can be imagined, and also working on time with the idea that you can immediately start to give back some areas to the city. There is a bike path that is already there. You can, although there is a steel industry, you can use it, and then going towards the longer term. And to conclude here, I think that what is fundamental is that we, as urbanists, especially here I'm really speaking of urbanists, we have to restart a dialogue and alliances with economists. We have to speak of development, of economic development in the transition, and of this spatial factor that is related to this. I think that we have forgotten this relation with economists. It's coming back not rarely, and there are not so many economists that are really ready to discuss with us, but I think that's the only way to work on economies and on capitals, where space, of course, is one of the capitals. So the horizontal metropolis is, in a way, is an hypothesis to work on a different hierarchy inside the territories, and these are some of the book that were related to that. The very last one, I'm sorry for some of the Dutch people that already listened to that, is about this concept that is underlying many of the things we are proposing, that is the concept of resilience, of which I think we are not yet able to catch the disruptive power. This is one project on which we are working in this moment, and it is one of the valleys that has been struck by the flooding last year in 2021, in July, so it's 1 year. It is at the border between Germany, Holland, and Belgium, and thousands of buildings have been hit by this flooding. Some people lost their life, and a couple of weeks ago there was this human chain organized by Flemish volunteers. So we are always in the Walloon region. The Flemish volunteers, they came after the flood, a lot of them, and they say, one of them is saying, we had to help people. We came almost every weekend with a bus. If in 20 years the sea covers us, Flemish people, we hope that the Walloons will come to help us too. So there is this idea of solidarity that is brought immediately to the fore, and we have to understand that we will not be able to solve anything without an enlarged idea of territorial solidarities. We go through the complexity of all the elements that are needed to understand what happened last year. We are working with the University of Liège, with all the different expertise they bring, and we try to connect all this expertise in 3, let's say, main themes. The first, considering the river as a subject, as I already explained, the role of being subjects. Here, for example, we see in red the space that the rivers took last year, superposed to the valleys indicated in the 18th century maps by Ferraris. And you see that simply what happened was that the water took its own space, the flood plain. Of course, nothing strange, but along the flood plain there were industries, and there are still industry, cities, etc. Second point is the river valley as an object of rationalization. This is something fundamental that all people that are working on, say, water-related question knows very, very well. We need to understand the devices that transform the territory, the behavior of the water, from the drainage system on the mountains, the change in the flow of the river, and let's say just understand that we simply construct the risk. You see in the small 3 schemes, the cities are there exactly in the flood plain. And third element is the river valley as a socio-economic entity. Of course, people are living there. Who is living there? The poorest. So the most fragile part of the population in a region that is already largely behind the rest of Belgium, the poorest, they live there. So there is a big problem, because for the resilience, you would say you should not reconstruct there. All the buildings that have been demolished, a lot of social housing. Let's not reconstruct. So where is going the social housing? Who is going to reconstruct this social housing? Where are going the poorest? So these are the type of problems we are facing today. We have also to remember that in the past, in the mid of the 19th century, there was this idea that industry was bringing kind of pastoral relation with a beautiful valley. It was a kind of utopia, very, very soon changed in something similar to what you see on the other side. So, starting from all this reading, what we have constructed now a first map that we called the map of the potential resilience to flooding. We start from that. We start from the fact that on the higher part today is all trees, pine, firs. And those first were accompanied by a system of draining that completely impoverished the soil, that was a pit soil that was acting as a sponge. And this is very important because it's covering 1/3 of all the water basin and has consequences because the water now is going very fast towards the lower part of the valley. On the other side, the agricultural plateau, there was a type of agriculture that was with orchards, with a lot of bocage. All that was, again, helping the soil to be more stable, to infiltrate the water. And again, this is bringing today much more problems, together with all the industrial areas that developed on the upper part, close to the highway, and without, let's say, any tool to slow down the water. And all the built tissue should also contribute in order to slow down this water, which means also that we can imagine systems of public spaces, of multifunctional spaces related to this function. And finally, in the floodplain, where we have the true problem that is at the same time a social problem, so a strong political problem, and the ecological problem for the river to find its own space. And here it's more difficult to say today what we are going to do. For the moment, we mapped the potential. The potential is here, there might be space for the river, but those are almost all buildable areas or built areas. So, of course, you can imagine the difficulty of this kind of connection. But at least we said that instead of speaking of the fragilities, let's speak of the potentials, what we can do. So to conclude this part, mapping the potential instead of the fragilities, showing that there are still potentials, and also clarifying the question of territorial solidarity, because as you see, to speak of the floodplain, we need to speak of the plateau. And the plateau, they have to understand this point. We have to work at the same time on ecological, which means floods and drought, because we know that in the future the drought will be probably even more important than the floods. So we have to find a way to construct spaces useful for both. And at the same time, we have to work on this socioeconomic resilience. Resilience, for me, is a way to enter the core of the modern mechanism of resistance. We have been living, and this is a true biopolitical question, the idea of being safe through resistance. We have to afford now the fact of not being safe or being just partially safe, and to work on different type of mechanism. When you go through resilience strategies, you clearly are criticizing the order of things, the priorities, and the actual hierarchies. And the two questions on which now we start to reflect also with a set of scenarios is how could socioeconomic choices enhance and strengthen flood resilience potentials? Or, said in a different way, which consequences can have choices about resilience on socioeconomic visions? So how can we connect finally the two dimensions? Okay, I am at the end. You understand why I'm speaking of transition as a new biopolitical projects. And I want to conclude with two dimensions, I think, of this hypothesis of a new biopolitical project. But first of all, I think we have to reconstruct the epistemological basis of the transition. So how design and how, let's say, all our activity through design can bring a knowledge about this transition, using design, I'm sorry to say that, as a powerful device. It's a powerful device, at least it's the only one we have. So let's say that it's powerful. The second, the ontological basis of the transition. So I think we are really shifting and we are changing our way to, I mean, really the fundamental of our thinking. And we need, because of this shift, to explore value systems that do not coincide with the current ones. So nevertheless, we are obliged to go out of the comfort zone. And I think that by constructing with our design research, counter spaces or advocating for spatial conditions, we can at least allow ourselves to systematically analyze and practice the set of paradigm shifts that are required. I close with this quotation from Edgar Morin. Beyond the idea of ecological transition, which reduces the problem to that of the transition from a non-green society to the same green society, in fact, it is the complex metamorphosis from one type of society to another. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. Thanks very much. We'll open a discussion with people in the room. Is there anybody who wants to react to both presentations, which seem quite judiciously articulated, because you raised questions and said, I don't want to give some answers, and then we had some answers appearing also. I don't want to start going into detail myself, so does anybody want to start? No? Yes, you? Okay, Carlos, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. You spoke about one problem, a question what to strategy was very important, but more relevant. I mean, two concepts for me was very important. The soil as a subject, not just as the resources, okay? And the other point you told about is we are not able to design the transition, you know? It's in capacity and because of course if it's necessary to change the society, you know, way of thinking, of course, it's very, very ambitious, hard, you know, work. But I agree with you, and above all in European or developed cities, it's of course it's like this. But anyway, okay, not to be so defeatist. I mean, it's possible with local actions, with local, which is like attitude, is perhaps empowerment attitude is perhaps possible to start this process. So, I mean. My question is, okay, how local attitudes could contribute, in your experience, in your way of your research, to push this process of make change in this mentality? That's all.
Oh gosh, I mean, yeah. Local attitudes. I think we can also start with personal attitudes to stuff, no? Sort of instead of sort of shifting it to a slightly more anonymous level of the local, no? Whatever that might mean. I think we can talk about personal attitudes towards. I mean, I talk about extractivist systems. No? I think you mentioned some of those also in your design. You talked about food, you talked about agriculture, you talked about behavior as well. And I think there's quite a lot that can be done on a very, very individual level that doesn't have to go to the level of the local, but at the same time, of course, it can be supported by local initiatives, local structures, local policies. And I think what can be done, I mean, we see it in your city here. No? You were talking about how the city, with a new politics, changed immensely towards a city not without conflict. That is today, at least from my perspective, very much supporting, for example, no, the tram, the pedestrians, the cycles. No? It's a massive transition that took place here, and that was supported by politics also, no? by someone who was also locally strong enough to push this forward against certain resistances, I guess, as well. No? So I think I would always start with the personal, no? Because the personal is also the political, no? in many ways. To also really bring it down to each and every one of us, no? That we have this kind of fate also in our hands.
Yeah, I think that we are inside a context, and we cannot imagine to stop the city and until the moment which everything is solved and a new type of city will be there. So we have to evolve together with this cultural transformation that is also going through us. I mean, the way in which we think the project in the last 20 years has changed. This is where I think the question of the culture of the transition is very important. We have to be attentive to the construction of this culture, because when it will become a collective culture, probably we will make this transition. What I'm saying that we are not able, we have not the capacity, is because the facts are saying, the numbers are saying that what we do is not enough, but drastically not enough. I was really deceived by listening to this conference by one of these people that wrote down the report by showing this diagram, which you see that in fact the emissions are horizontal. You say, how is it possible with what we are saying? Imagine all the discourses of and finally this line is still there. But I don't read this as okay, but then nothing to do. No, I think that we have to do more, and we are inside this process. And with our project, that more and more understand maybe also some possible strategies. You start to discuss with the cities, for example. The transition asks to reorganize the cities, reorganize the way in which public officials, they work, all the services, the green together with the street, together with the housing, together with the economy. Everything has to work in a different way. So all these experimentations are all ongoing, still a little bit confused in a way, but at the same time, maybe at a certain moment there will be really the effect. The effect will be tangible. For the moment, it's not really so tangible.
Okay, probably if there's anybody else in the room who wants to speak, yeah, Kent.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be really brief for a change. I heard a lot, I saw something in common between Tatjana, your call for counter-discourses, counter-hegemonic discourses, and working at another scale on the one hand, and Paola, you're speaking about special zones, public surfaces. So Tatjana, I'd like to know what you think about Paola's call for special zones, and Paola, I'd like to know if what you're talking about when you say we need special zones where we can experiment things, does that mean free from the usual bureaucratic and regulations and such, or is it free from capitalism, which would be, I feel like a 1970s power rock singer. Does it mean free from, well, in other words, would it mean public power taking over from private interests entirely? Would that be a special zone?
Special zones. I guess we have quite a lot of special zones in many ways already, no? And maybe you have to explain more what you mean by special zones. But you could argue that we have certain areas in our cities that might already be governed differently, no? We might have areas that test certain ways of transitioning. We have areas where sort of agriculture is tested. We have these kind of special zones. Maybe no, your idea is somewhat more expanded than that. So, but the question for me is, and I tried to raised that yesterday as well, is the point of connection with one another. I think there's a danger of these things remaining islands of otherness, you could say, without maybe not even the intention to sort of go into a different level, I guess. No? When I think you talk about these special zones, I think it's really important that it's clear that they're meant to be amplified, not necessarily scaled in the way that capital can be scaled, no? But in the way they're amplified, connected with other things, so that this these points that exist individually are then sort of connected amongst one another, and then sort of can grow together in a way, no? like a rhizome or something like that. So this is maybe something I would be interested in, no? How you create these connections that that support the sort of, I hate these words, no? The kind of sustain, no? I don't know how to say this, no? The kind of sort of growing together somehow to eventually also cover the other stuff.
Thank you for these reflections, and of course I would very much like to enlarge the debate on this. That's why I insist on the principle of continuity of space, because I think that when things are continuous, there is also the possibility for them to work better, to go together. It's a little bit like, you know, ecologists when they speak of a forest, no? A small forest grows slower than a bigger forest that grows better because it's bigger. No? It can have more potential to grow. So I think that the principle of continuity, that is a principle on which we have constructed this idea of, we call them not only weak structure, because we thought it was a little bit too hermetic for, say, to discuss with the people. But so we used the term of eco-social infrastructure, metropolitan eco-social infrastructure of continuity. So it is an infrastructure of continuity at the metropolitan scale, and it contains both the social and the ecological dimension, which means that it is considered as a space both for ecology, biodiversity, animals, etc., for people, but also for different types of activities, including agriculture or including other types of activities. And coming back to your question, yes, I think we need spaces that are not submitted to the same rules as the market rules. And why I think it's not too ingenuous to say that. Geneva, for example, has a tradition of spatial zones in the French territory related to agriculture. Geneva is a city without territory, practically. Since centuries, is dependent on the French side for what concerns, for example, the food. While today we have the tendency to say that the French side is dependent on Geneva, but during the pandemic it was very clear that it was Geneva depending on the French side, also for the people that had to come to work, even during the pandemic, when everything was closed, the frontier remained open, because otherwise hospitals, etc., could not work at all. So you understand that the question of resilience is not a banal aspect. So there is this dependency of the city from the territory, and I use this term of spatial zone. So if this is considered very important for the life of Geneva, I think that today we can reframe this idea of spatial zone by giving this content. So a zones where you can experiment something fundamental for our life in the future. So these transition strategies, which are at the same time ecological and social, without a distinction. So we are not looking just for the green and blue network. No, it's not just that. It's more than that, and we want to really to bring also the social inside. But bringing the social inside means that you have to rediscuss the conditions. That's why I think it's a spatial zone, and in my idea, is an infrastructure that should disappear once this transition, because at a certain moment we will have to do this transition. Once the transition is done, you will not have the need to underline or to make it more visible this infrastructure. It will be just something belonging to the rest.
We'll just take the last question because we're kind of pressed with time, and it's to you also. So it's the question from Safa. I'm sorry, I'm not saying your full name because I don't have the full name on the screen. So it's a question for Paola Vigano. So we just have a short answer, you know, to keep our timelines. The question says, I wanted to know your opinion on the current practices of reuse of resources, especially for the case of intervention in the demolition phase to recover resources, of second work to use them on other projects. What do you think are the limits of the reuse of resources, and is there no risk of going towards an exploitation of what is called a resource, or of wanting to demolish buildings and claim behind the reuse of materials from these demolitions?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, but I think we would need to make a different seminar dedicated to all this point. Maybe for the moment, I would only say that first we have to read any situation, every territory, in a much more closer way. So I would say that the first consequences of this attitude that is now becoming an attitude for much more largely shared, is that we have to read. That's why I insist on this epistemology of the transition. We need to know differently and much better. So I see a need for reading cities, reading territory, reading materials, reading resources, as you were saying, much more important and continuous than we have been thinking in the past. Reading, first of all. And then I think there is the question of we have to live with the rest of 1 century and a half of industrialization. I mean, we have to live with that.
To live with that, yeah.
We have to live in the sense that we have to address. We will need probably more than 1 century to rework all these areas, and I think it is very urgent. And there are regions in Europe in which this is really a structural and a territorial problem. The pollution, the problem to the health of the people, the difficulty to reuse material, the interest, simply the attractivity of these areas. Because in many of the situations I showed, there is practically no attractivity. So there are not really programs. So you have to do with less in this sense. You have to give the territory also the time to reconquer by its own strength some qualities. And in any case, I think is something you cannot avoid. We have created this problem, and we have to live with this problem.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to make this so short, but as you said earlier on, I think we will keep on talking about these topics when we're having our final cocktail. The idea now is to move to the feedbacks on the parallel sessions. So the persons who have been working on the texts, including myself, we will try and give you feedback as well as possible on the past parallel sessions of the 2 days where these took place. Okay.